an old friend. And just for a brief introduction, Dick is originally from southeastern Wisconsin, and he was the guy who really jabbed and poked and prodded the department to do more data on wolves. He started the first wolf project in Wisconsin, and I spent many happy hours with him out in the field and saw a lot of interesting things. And then after 9 years of doing that, he became the head of the Sandhill Outdoor Skills Education Center and was 20-some years for that. And he is a whole host of interests and is a wonderful speaker. I've heard him talk many times on wolves. Today, because he was stationed at Sandhill, he's going to tell you about these two people, Wallace and Ruth Grange. And he'll tell you a little bit about the Sandhill Wildlife Area, and if you've never been there, I would recommend going to see it. It's really a gem to see. And he's got a lot of interesting stories to tell about these two people, and he'll give you a little bit of the background. So without further ado, Dick Thiel, take it away.
Thank you, Chuck. Well, it's a pleasure to be here talking to fellow conservationists. So thank you for the invitation. It took a while to get me here because I'm in retirement, actually busier than when I worked, which is crazy. So, and I always tell people that I worked for free when I was employed, and wildlife biology is a life sentence, so I might as well just keep doing it. So here I am. So I'm going to be talking about two unknowns who were giants in the wildlife conservation field. Their footprint is huge in the state of Wisconsin. Unfortunately, they're overshadowed by a bunch of other people. Notably, one of them is Alda Leopold. And that always grinds me. I'm not knocking Alda Leopold because phenomenal. But Wallace Grange was something else. In fact, Joe Hickey used to take his students up to Sandhill Game Farm, and when he first initiated doing that, he did it on the recommendation of Leopold, who said, take your guys up to Sandhill and see how habitat management is done. And so Wallace Grange was a giant, and I'm trying to resurrect him a little bit. And in my retirement, I always have, and I do a lot of reading, and I do a lot of research, archival. In retirement, I have no boring days, and I don't even know what that's like. So I'm waiting for the nursing home, and we'll see what happens then. But in any event, I want to talk to you about these. I'm going to see if I can get this to work. So, whoops, I just did something else there. So let me go see. I hit the side button all the time. Forgive me, I'm an old man, and that happens sometimes. So there we go. Okay. So I am here to talk to you about Wallace and Hazel Grange. And one of the other things I wanted to do is promote Wallace's most recent book, which he published about 30 years after his death. Actually, it was a manuscript I found in his archives. And a guy by the name of Joe Breitenstein and I edited it, and we got the University of Wisconsin Press to publish it. And it just came out in 2020, and I have a few copies here in case anybody wants one. They're $30, cash only, but in any event, you might get a signature from me, but in any event. What I want to do really is in this talk, I want to talk to you about how Wallace became Wallace Grange, the professional. And so we go back a little bit over 100 years. And I want you to understand that when Wallace came of age to become a wildlife biologist, there really still was no professional field of wildlife biology. He was one of the drivers that became that profession in the 1930s, really. And so this far predates, his development really far predates, the profession that I'm in. He was born in Wheaton, Illinois, and he lived there until he was about 15 years old. I think he was 13 years old. His parents were both educated religiously, and his father was a minister. His father lost his job in the ministry due to some altercation with some of the church elders, and then he kind of floundered. And although he did okay, he bounced from job to job. And he came from a large family, and he had a lot of brothers, and his brothers were well situated in that suburban Chicago that area. And so he basically did such things as house moving, and there are photos in the archives that are amazing. Horse-drawn houses going down the city of Wheaton, two-story houses being drawn by horses, and logs that have a diameter like this. A team of horses would pull out the back or the front log and drag it to it was just crazy to watch how they rolled them down the streets at that time. But in any event, when Wallace was born, his mother used to put him on the front porch, and you can kind of see that porch there has no railings. And put him in a buggy, and he would just entertain himself listening to bird calls while she was doing housework, until one day he might have got excited and started kicking or something, but in any event, the carriage went careening off the porch and he broke his wrist as an infant. And so Mom had to put an end to that. But his fascination from birds was probably instantaneous upon his birth. And so he basically was really a professional birder by the time he was about 10 years of age. And part of that was because he developed an interest in birds and found out by going to the library and reading some of the early periodicals of that time, Forest and Stream and things like that, that there was a guy in the neighboring village, Glen Flora, who was an ornithologist of some repute. And that guy's name was Benjamin Galt. And so being a boy, he just took it upon himself to hike over to Glen Flora, which today you'd probably get killed by 6 million cars. But in any event, back in those days, there was actually a little bit of farm space. And on the way, of course, he was watching birds and learning things about it. But he just knocks on this guy's door, finds out that this man had gone around the world collecting birds. That means shooting them and stuffing them and selling them to the Field Museum. He was an oologist of repute, so he collected bird eggs and bird nests. And when he saw this young man of 8 or 10 years old coming over to the audacity of this little guy to come over and say, "Hey, I heard that you're a bird watcher. Can you teach me some things?" They formed a friendship. And that went on the remainder of the time that Wallace stayed there. In fact, they would go out to Uncle Ernst's farm on the southwest side of Wheaton and photograph bird eggs. Wallace would find them, and that's a killdeer nest right there in the lower corner that he got Benjamin Galt to go photograph. Now keep in mind, at that time period, naturalists were still documenting, precisely where did all these things, where were they distributed? So you had to do things like take photographs or collect eggs, those kinds of things. That was the mindset of that time period. And so Wallace was actually contributing to Benjamin Galt, and Benjamin Galt was certainly one of his big mentors. And so in any event, that went on for a few years. What happened was that at the end of World War I, when Grange had just graduated from 8th grade, his dad lost yet another job, and he was working on Uncle Ernst's farm, and he decided he just had enough of that. And I believe, although we have no direct knowledge of this, but back in that day, the northern cutover country, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, the lumber barons, when they would get done raping and pillaging the forests, they actually had partners in what was called land speculation. And those were, today we call them real estate agents. But in any event, they would sell these landscapes that had been cut over and burned over to unsuspecting immigrants coming over the Great Pond. And in the wake of World War I, some commodities were still increasing, including farms and farming produce, because that had to go over to Europe to feed the hordes that basically lost everything in World War I. And so land was at a premium. And so these guys would put in advertisements, and I presume his father probably picked up the newspaper and kept reading all the wonders that you could reap from just throwing seeds in the ground, not realizing, of course, first you got to get rid of the popple and the stumps that are between the popple trees. But in any event, his dad jumped on a train, went up to Ladysmith to a town site called Crane, and bought 80 acres, and then returned and told his wife and his 3 sons, from his second marriage that they were going to be moving to this little tiny village called Crane. Crane was on the Sioux line that extended from Ladysmith to Duluth and had just been punched through to Duluth a year and a half earlier. And there was a spur, a logging railroad grade at Crane, the Crane Junction. The spur went up into what we now know as the Flambeau State Forest, which at that time was one of the last remaining large tracts of virgin timber in the state of Wisconsin, even in that day. And so in any event, what happened was that he hauled the family up to Crane and put them on a wagon, and basically drove them out to the site about 1.5 miles west of this little spur, and looked at the landscape and said, well, here's our place. And again, keep in mind that Mom and Dad were educated, and they highly valued education, and they instilled that in their children. And all of them were going to go through high school. And his first marriage with his first 3 sons, his father incidentally was also named Wallace, but his middle name is different than the Wallace I'm talking about. The father's name was Wallace Sumner, so I'm going to call him Sumner from now on, so you don't confuse him with the other Wallace, which is the guy I'm really talking about. But in any event, they basically asked their children, do you really want to go to high school? And at that point in time, Wallace said yes. The problem was Dad, Sumner, was 62 years old. Now, how do you remove all those stumps and all those popple trees, and how do you carve a farm out of that? He needed back-breaking labor. He needed those 3 sons. Roger had just graduated from high school, and he wanted to go to college. Wallace was going to enter high school, and then Neil, his youngest brother, was about 4 years behind Wallace and was still in grade school. They all 3 skipped out of school that year because they needed labor. But the agreement with Mom, who was the real kingpin in the family, she said, Sumner, you've got a year for my boys' labor, but after that, if they want to go to school, they're going to school. And so that was the way it was. And in this book, the book is a memoir of his childhood, and it really describes how he became a wildlife biologist. It's beautifully written. But in any event, the stuff that they went through to carve this landscape, and keep in mind there were thousands of families, across this cutover country doing exactly the same stuff at the same time, and the amount of labor and the hard pain and the back-breaking labor and the bugs and the birds that would come in and eat all your oats before they were mature, and just all of that stuff was just crazy. So in any event, that's what they did. Now, Mother, of course, had come from the upper scale parts of suburban Chicago to a log cabin where there was absolutely no possibility of any of the amenities that she actually started seeing in Wayton, such as electricity was starting to become available, and that would just not be something that she would ever see at Crane, Wisconsin. And so this was quite a transition for most of the family, except, of course, for Wallace, because he's now in hog heaven. There are birds galore out there, and there's trees, and there's animal life that he would never ever believe that he would ever be able to see. And so this was just he was just a sponge for all this knowledge. Of course, he had no teachers. He had to teach himself. And so he became really a self-taught naturalist. And so one of the things that he describes in the book, which I think is absolutely fascinating, is this railroad spur that went out of Crane just nagged at him. It was begging for him to explore that country because all the stuff he lived in was this cutover stuff, but there was the big timber somewhere up that line, and it already exceeded somewhere around 10 or 15 miles off the Sioux line, and he really wanted to go see the big timber before it was gone. And one of the things he wanted to do was see how the bird life changed once you got into the big timber. And so he was able on one July 4th in particular to basically got the day off. Mom and Dad said you could go do what you wanted. At 3 o'clock in the morning, he put his little lunch in his pack sack and he walked to Crane, and then he started walking up the railroad grade, which of course is not active during the summer months. And he walked 17 miles up that railroad grade, and he finally got to the big timber. And it just was an amazing thing. The bad news for poor Wallace was that he had to turn around because it was going to get dark long before he got home. And so he walked something like 30 miles that day. And he made his objective, which he saw the big timber. And he thought it was just the most marvelous thing he'd ever seen. Now, I think some of the things that are really important for us to comprehend at this point in time is that even at that stage, the big timber was almost gone in Wisconsin. And for someone to, that could actually, as a professional, and he was a budding professional at that point, but as a professional actually see that and actually document some of the things that he witnessed in there in terms of bird life. And incidentally, he carried a bird book ledger with him wherever he went from the time he was about 8 years old. To document that kind of stuff, I mean, these are treasures that none of us as professionals ever would see in the state of Wisconsin, because they just, in my career, that stuff just didn't exist. So really, really neat. That first year went, and Wallace gets to pick. So what does he do? He says, yeah, I want to go to high school. And they were cutting popple like crazy during the winter months, and they had all this popple, but now the markets for timber had dropped, because now you're in the recession after this big war. And they had no market for any of this stuff, and they had all this timber laying around. And so the deal that Mom and Dad struck was with an elderly couple in Ladysmith, 10 miles away, was to allow Wallace to live in a lean-to kitchen sleeping area, which used to be the woodshed attached to the back of their kitchen, which had a little potbelly stove and a cot. Allowed him to stay there in return for a year's supply of cooking fuel, which of course was popple. And so Wallace was allowed to go to high school. And the way he did that, and I remember working at Sandhill and talking to some of the guys that I work with who knew Wallace, and they all told the story about how fast that guy walked in the woods and his long stride. And they also related stories about how he walked to school from his house 10 miles to Ladysmith. And he did. Now I ask you today, how many high school students would ever pay that kind of price to attend high school? Nobody would do something that crazy. He would get up at 4:30 in the morning on Mondays, and he would go 1.5 miles through the woods, and he would hop the Sioux Line tracks and walk down to Ladysmith. He would go right directly to school. In the evening, he would go to the where he was boarding. Every morning, he would pack up his stuff, and then he would go to school, and as soon as school was let out, he would jump the tracks and he would walk the 10 miles back home. He'd be there on Friday night somewhere around 6. His record time for walking was 2 hours and 10 minutes. And one other time it was 5 hours because he was walking against the wind in a blizzard. And so this is what this man did. The really cool thing was that he had an opportunity to see all kinds of different habitats in that 10 miles. And he would see the different species of birds, and he was able to relate, prairie chickens are only in these big, big open things, and Connecticut warblers are only found in bog areas. And so he was able to just get these associations, and he didn't learn that in books. He learned that by, just observing, and he became a very keen observer. Well, also in this book, there's a love story. So when he was a freshman, the first week he's in school, he meets amongst his classmates, and I think there were 14. He meets this girl, and he was mesmerized by her. And he goes home that week, and he tells his older brother about her, and he's just smitten by her. And Hazel, of course, whom he did marry later on in life, wrote a book herself called Live Arrival Guaranteed. And what I really love is the contrast between what he says about meeting Hazel, which is in this book, what Hazel said about him in her book. And if you don't know what a hair shirt is, you can envision horsehair would be very, very itchy. And so he was just a big itch to her. And so, and they were competitors because of the fact that they were competing for the top position intellectually in their class. And she did not like that competition because all of a sudden here's this upstart and he's showing up on her. So about Hazel, by the time that Wallace met her, she was already orphaned. She was living with the county clerk, and she served not only going to high school and she wanted to complete it in 3 years because her life was so crazy. She wanted to complete it in 3 years, but she served as their governess, helping out with chores, especially with regards to his children, and then also doing some of the cooking and the cleaning. And in return, of course, she got board, or a room, I should say, and board. But to basically get clothing, she relied on some of her sisters and the ingenuity of them to be sewing with stuff that they would, gather up, and also she worked for a time, I've read, at a Nickelodeon inside Ladysmith at that time, and so she earned some of her money, none of which was spent frivolously. This was a person who lived hand to mouth, and she went to school doing all this. During that time period, that brief time period that they were together in school, I guess it was the superintendent of school, decided to start a debate club. Hazel jumps right on it, and of course Wallace is going, I get a chance to be closer to her, so he jumps on it. And so they were in a debate club, and he actually got to go on to state competition and then a regional competition because he won the state competition, and he lost in the regional competition, but he came in number 2 even at that. She left her sophomore year and moved on to other cities where some of her sisters lived, and she bounced around. She caught scarlet fever her last semester in high school in Milwaukee, and it nearly put her in the grave. Because at that time, of course, there were no antibiotics, and scarlet fever is bacterial, and she was really bad off. But there was a sister that still lived in Ladysmith, so every once in a while she'd show up, and of course when she showed up, she kind of did by then have a hunkering for him, and so they would get together and spend evenings and stuff like that. The neat thing about Wallace is his junior and senior year, he got a job at a local newspaper. There were 2 competing newspapers in Ladysmith at the time, and eventually that owner allowed Wallace to write a column, which gave him some really good skills writing. And that explains why he's such a good writer, because that was the nucleus of how that all started. And so all of these things are formative, and they're really amazing. So he graduates as a salutatorian from Ladysmith High School in 1924. And he believes that, and this is really kind of a cool quote, in terms of reflecting back on his childhood at Crane, he said, "The wild country has shaped me, molded me in its crucible of winter storms, its toll, its harshness, its beauty, its isolation, and its solitude." There's the attraction that basically molded him into what he became. So he attended the University of Wisconsin in 1924-25. He spent the next summer in the Forest Service roaming about Wyoming and Colorado doing such disparate things as counting sheep, because of course there was grazing allotments, and doing survey work, survey work to figure out how high were some of the Colorado mountains, and then where can we put the roads that are going to extract the timber. So he got a really good experience in that kind of stuff. He acted as field assistant collecting birds in Florida under Arthur Holmes Howell, who worked for the U.S. Biological Service, and that became the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in later years. And his second year of life, in college that is, was spent working under Dr. Lee Dice at the University of Michigan. And while there, and he's still an undergraduate, he's really just a sophomore, he started studying the pelage phenology of snowshoe hares, which is one of the animals that he truly, truly loved, and which he became an expert in. And so this is a picture of a snowshoe hare on his mom and dad's farm. Incidentally, the only meat they got during those formative years when they were cutting popple trees, the only meat they got was shooting snowshoe hares. So they ate a lot of them. So other experiences in the university. Back in those days, there weren't a lot of people that were in wildlife or zoology, and those that were, if they were in university, they rubbed shoulders with one another, and they became peers and associates and friends for the remainder of their lives. And these 2 guys are movers and shakers in the wildlife world in the formative years and beyond, Adolph and Olaus Muri. They both attended under Dr. Lee Dice at University of Michigan and got their PhDs. Olaus became one of the founders of the Wilderness Society. His artwork was featured in Wild Animal Tracks with the Peterson Guides back in the 60s. Phenomenal artist. And Adolph Muri worked for the National Park Service his entire career. He started work, notable work was the moose starvation on Isle Royale National Park in the 1930s, coyote ecology in Yellowstone National Park, and probably one of the first objective studies of wolves in Denali National Park, the wolves of Mount McKinley. That's Hazel, that's Wallace, that is Adolph Murray, and that was the wedding of the Granges. They stood up in his wedding, and they were the only ones that stood up because it was performed in Ann Arbor, and moms and dads couldn't come. Of course, she didn't have any parents anymore at that point in time, so they were very close. Problem was that just after their marriage in April of 27, his mother had a heart attack, and he was needed back home in Ladysmith, and that essentially ended his college career. So he had 2 years essentially of college life, and that was it because he was needed at home. So what happened was that I shouldn't have had that do that, but that's okay. Edwin Dahlberg was one of the first Wisconsin Conservation Commissioners for the Wisconsin Conservation Commission, which became the Wisconsin Conservation Department. Dahlberg was actually one of his high school teachers. And when they were expanding the Conservation Commission to include such things as game management, which was just a concept at that time, he asked his fellow commissioners to interview Wallace Grange. And Wallace Grange became, at age 22, the first superintendent of game in the state of Wisconsin, now known as the Bureau of Wildlife Management Director for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. And if you look at all these old farts here, there's Wallace, 22 years of age. And he held that position for 2 years. And one of the first things that he had to do, and it's an immediate challenge for any agency, because these are all of the states were creating wildlife, or game, we called it game management at that time, programs. And so one of the things that were huge challenges was, well, where did the game stocks, where did they still occur within your state? So you had to do surveys. Where were these things? You know, where were the deer? Where were the bear? Where were the ruffed grouse? Those kinds of things. Ducks. I mean, just think of it. They had to actually survey the state. This is a huge, huge responsibility for one person, because he was the Bureau. He was one person, that was it. Land acquisition, habitat restoration. Well, how are you going to get game back? The whole place, the whole state is destroyed. You've got to start buying land, and you've got to look at what land has potential. And so that was another challenge that he had to tackle. Predator control. Okay, so now you've got some of this land, and you're propagating these animals in game farms and back out on the landscape. You sure don't want great horned owls taking those animals. And so predator control was a necessary thing back in those days, which of course nobody cared much about. You know, the less predators, the better. But in any event, all of these things were things that he had to actually start working on. And that was a challenge for him. In 1930, he moved on to Washington, D.C. to manage bird research for the U.S. Biological Survey. Remember his association as an assistant field person in Florida and the association with the U.S. Biological Survey. And so through that connection, that's how he got employed there. They also began to buy land in Wood County, Wisconsin, which eventually would become called Sandhill Game Farm, which we'll talk about in a moment. Between 1932 and 37, he retired from the Biological Survey, and I presume that he just could not stand government work. I just think he was an individual who could not stand to be told what to do, when to do it. You know, he worked on his own, at his own pace, his own volition, and he just couldn't do that. And so he left the business of government at that point. And he went back to that private game farm that he and his wife had established. And incidentally, he established that when he was the game manager in the state of Wisconsin. And he established the first game farm in the state of Wisconsin, which his successor, a guy by the name of Mackenzie, which some of you might know, moved down to Poynette because his dad in Poynette actually was a farmer, a rich farmer, and kind of dabbled in real estate. And there was some kind of a deal struck between moving the game farm that Wallace got in Peninsula State Park and moving it down to Poynette where it existed. So kind of an interesting little thing. But in any event, he had that private game farm, and they began also at the same time live trapping snowshoe hares out of the U.S. Forest Service lands in northern Minnesota and northwestern Wisconsin, because of the new forests that were sprouting up from the stumps were being devastated, so the foresters said, by snowshoe hares girdling the seedlings and the saplings. They wanted them out of there, and they were poisoning snowshoe hares. They were shooting them. They were doing everything they could. And Grange was like, "No, you can't do that." And so he got them to basically allow him to capture snowshoe hares, and he found markets for them in New York State, where hunters wanted snowshoe hares but had wiped them out, and so they were willing to buy snowshoe hares if he would transport them there. And so, of course, there were a lot of railroad grades that would do that kind of stuff. So that's basically, he got into the game farming business in a big way at that point in time. Now, Sand Hill Game Farm. This is the Central Sands unit up there, and those are the counties. That is Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac stuff. And the shack is on the southern terminus of Glacial Lake, Wisconsin. Sand Hill Game Farm is on the northwest corner of that same geological feature. And so they were both parked in pretty much the same kind of stuff. What happened was that Wallace started seeing this area in Wood County, and all of it was becoming tax delinquent. And it started in the 1920s, and by the mid-1920s, look at how much of that was tax delinquent. Lots of landowners are all going belly up, and they can't pay their taxes. And you can't pay your taxes for X amount of years in a row. Basically, there's a sheriff's sale if you're lucky, and if nobody buys, it just reverts back to the county as on the county coffers. Well, there are still going to be sales because they want to get that land off the books, and so that land went up for sale. And Wallace, seeing that pattern, started buying up these lands. For the longest time, I couldn't figure out where he got the money. But now I realize that he was borrowing money heavily from banks. And imagine, this is the Depression. This is the bottom of the Depression. And he got banks to basically lend him money on this harebrained scheme of building 10,000 acres, putting a fence around it, and basically selling the surplus commodities, which is surplus animals off of it, and get an income from it and pay back the bank in the meantime. Nuts! But that's what he started doing. So, between 1939 and 62, he formed a corporation called Sand Hill Game Farm, Inc., and about 10,000 acres was put into production with a fence around it. And in a book I'm working on, he has a book-length manuscript on this thing. I'm working on that right now. But in one of those chapters, he said, I had long contemplated the game farm business, envisioning the establishment of a semi-natural game farm primarily devoted to the production of native wildlife species. Now, most game farms, of course, they house the animals in a quasi-open area, but they provide all of the feed and all of the water. In this case, he's not going to provide much, if any, feed, and he's not going to provide water. Those critters have to find that themselves, so this is a quasi-wild situation, which had never really been experimented with up to that point in terms of game farming. And so this was rather radical departure. Now, he's most famous for his deer that he hauled out of there. And some of the sandhill deer went down to such places as Florida, Mississippi, and some of the other southern states to replenish their depleted white-tailed deer herds. And in particular, he explains in this manuscript I'm working on that Florida in particular had an outbreak of some type of a tick that was killing cattle. And so the tick was normally found on white-tailed deer. Didn't affect the white-tailed deer, or at least they didn't know whether they did at that time. And so what they wanted to do is wipe out the deer, which they did. And then, of course, hunters wanted deer. Where are you going to get it? Well, there's this guy up in Wisconsin that's willing to sell you some deer. So after the tick problem abated livestock-wise, they started reintroducing deer, and Wallace had a plan for that one. So everybody around central Wisconsin knows Sand Hill Game Farm is the deer capital, but where he made his money, which was not much at all, was in minnows. He estimated when he sold the game farm that he sold 10 million minnows over that 24-year period. Rats, muskrats, almost 12,000. Deer, a paltry 8,000. ruffed grouse, gray squirrel, cottontail, and there was like 20 or 30 species, fox snakes, you name it. You know, if somebody had a, you know, hey, Wallace, have you got blah, blah, blah? Sure, I can find you one of those things, you know. And so that was what his business was all about. And really, Hazel and he lived hand to mouth almost the entire time it was there. Chuck was asking me if I was going to talk about the, and I'm not going to talk about the fence wars, so you have to invite me down another time after I get his other book published, if I can, because he talks a lot about the fence wars. But in any event, and the fence wars basically where he built a fence around it, but it was pretty shabby, and the warden force said it was substandard and kept cutting his permits because he had to have permits from the state to basically game farm. And so they would yank his deer farm license because it was leaky. You know, deer could go through, you know, both ways, and that's not how a game farm's supposed to operate, especially nowadays with chronic wasting disease. But in any event, I'm done now with my talk. I want to just point out, I can't do Wallace Grange justice because the contributions he's made to early day conservation are enormous. And I would bore you to death with the litany of stuff that this guy did. For instance, he was the first wildlife manager in the state of Wisconsin. He actually was employed, while he was running the game farm, he was employed as the grouse biologist for the state of Wisconsin under the Pittman-Robertson Act. And he was the very first wildlife person in the state of Wisconsin that used controlled fire to burn land for prairie grouse. So number one thing he did was, you know, what we do today pretty typically is, you know, controlled burns. First guy to do that. So just as an example of all the stuff this guy did, he is considered, at the time, he was considered an expert with prairie grouse, both species, sharptails and prairie chickens. He was definitely an expert in white-tailed deer. Sandhill cranes, he wrote a book-length manuscript. I've seen this thick. But in any event, he never published that. I think that, what was the guy's name over in Michigan, the crane guy? Walkinshaw. Lawrence Walkinshaw beat him to the punch, and so he never published anything on that. Snowshoe hares, he actually, after he retired, was still writing professional articles in journals on snowshoe hares. So this guy was just, you know, he was an amazing guy. His books, Wisconsin Grouse Problems, was published by the Wisconsin Conservation Department in 1948. It was his first book-length book, or manuscript. And it's a thick book. It's full of all kinds of really cool history. It's very rare if you ever get a copy of it, you hold on to that bugger because nobody can get those things anymore. But in any event, very detailed history of early day conservation, especially in central Wisconsin. This is the best one. I read this probably as a teenager, and it was used in colleges, but it also was popularly written. The Way to Game Abundance, it was published by Schreibner's in 1949. And it's a big, thick book, but it's a very readable book. These things are way long out of print, unfortunately. Those of the Forest is his Hallmark book, published in 1953. Here's the deal. He writes this book, and it's the story of a fictional landscape, which you can tell is Wisconsin. It's an ecological treatise on the state of Wisconsin as viewed from the eyes of a snowshoe hare. Who would think of something? You had to be on some wacky weed or something to figure that stuff out. But this guy, it was just an amazing story. This little bunny rabbit's hopping through the forest and he bumps into a nest of ground hornets. And he goes into this litany about the ecology of ground hornets. He takes 3 more steps and he finds some wild sarsaparilla and he chews on that, and all of a sudden you're on a story about that plant, and it just goes on and on and on and on. And it's just a beautiful walk of ecology written in a style that you can actually appreciate and comprehend. Out of print, unfortunately. Incidentally, I told you that he is overshadowed by Alda Leopold. This book was self-published by his wife because she didn't want anybody touching it in terms of editing. So she basically published it herself. She created a publishing company, hired a printer, and they published it as the manuscript was. Guess who did the illustrations for it? Olaus Murie. And what was most fascinating about it is it won the John Burroughs Nature Writing Award for 1955, I believe it was, which is a prestigious nature writing award still to this day. And it's 1 or 2 books a year gets that, prestigious award. Leopold's Sand County Almanac was published in 1949, 4 years before this book, and it did not get the John Burroughs Award until about a decade after Granges' book. So, and then as I was going through his archives, and then of course Don Johnson, and you know Don Johnson, that name, he was the outdoor editor, writer for Milwaukee Sentinel. And I knew Don pretty much my entire career. And Don knew I was interested in conservation history, and he also knew that I was the educator at Sand Hill Wildlife Area, which is what Wallace left to the state. He and Hazel left to the state of Wisconsin. They sold it to the state of Wisconsin. It transitioned from a game farm to a wildlife area at that point in time in 1962. But Don was very good friends with the Granges, and he handed me that manuscript, and he said, we got to do something about this manuscript. And we tried publishing it, but nobody would bite on it. And so it sat in my office my personal office for 20 years. And then a friend of mine, Joe Breitenstein, and I resurrected it, and we were able to get University of Wisconsin Press to publish it. It's sitting here. $30 if you want a copy. But in any event, it's really just the story of his childhood and how he became what he was. And it's a fascinating read about an era that's long gone, that is just truly a remarkable historical document of that time. And in any event, it's his book, it's his handwriting, it's his work, and we just, Joe and I just edited it, so.
Can you get it off of Amazon?
You can,
Okay.
yep.
You won't get a signature though.
Yeah, you won't. So it's called As the Twig is Bent, and it's University of Wisconsin Press, and it's just Wallace Byron Grange. You should be able to find it on Amazon. So anyways, I think that's about it. Oh, I wanted to say something about Hazel Grange. She only published 1 book, and her writing style is totally different from Wallace. Live Arrival guaranteed. It's out of press. I think you can still get copies off of Amazon. It's a wonderful read about their life together, and only the last 300 pages about Sand Hill Game Farm, but it's a real good detail from a very different perspective. She seriously needs some person to do a biography on her, because what she went through as a woman at that time period is amazing. The barriers, the challenges, the stuff that lady went through, thick and thin, she stood right by that knucklehead and loved him to death and basically persevered. And at the end, she didn't even care about wildlife. She didn't care about any of that stuff. She was okay business manager. She did all the books, incidentally, in Sand Hill Game Farm Inc., of course, because that's what women can do, but they never get the credit for that stuff, right? And she did all the background stuff. And in fact, when he enlisted in World War II, believe it or not, he's 38, guess who got him enlisted? He was being rejected and rejected and rejected. Someone by the name of Aldo Leopold wrote a letter of recommendation, and he was picked up by the U.S. Navy and became a Seabee. And he was flown to the southwest corner of the Pacific Islands and became a censor. The servicemen would be writing letters and they'd black out the stuff or cut it out with a razor blade. He did that. He had a buddy by the name of Walter Scott who did pretty much similar things, and they traded notes between each other. I've not seen these notes, but I've heard on bird life on these weird islands. They were trading notes on all kinds of critters that they were seeing, because they were consummate naturalists. These guys were crazy. But back to her. She didn't care about wildlife at all, but she writes this beautiful book. And one of the things that I think is most impressive is this sentence near the end of her book, in terms of, all of a sudden, she's sitting in Sand Hill someday, and it was just when they were going to sell, and she looks out over the Gallagher Marsh. I can almost guarantee I know where the place is. And she looks out, and then this is her reflection. All of a sudden it came to her. Now I get it. Now I know why Wallace was so crazy about nature. So in any event, an incredible couple, and yet poorly known, which is unfortunate. So that's my job in retirement, is to try and resurrect them. So thank you. Any questions? And I'm going to take a drink here real quick, but any questions at all? Yep.
Can you speculate, or do you know why in the world he set up the first game farm in Door County, not centrally located?
Yeah, and the reason why was because there were only a couple of facilities owned by the Conservation Commission at the time, and one of them was Peninsula. And so that's why he did it. And it was right on the south terminus of the park. The game farm was, right on the south terminus of that park. There were only a few. Devil's Lake was one, I believe, and Peninsula was another. If you go into the warden histories, you'll find, and I don't think I'll ever do anything with this story, but he was out with a warden on Green Bay, and a storm came up, and the boat overturned, and the only guy that came back was Wallace. The warden drowned. And I think he was the second or third warden killed in service to the state. And Wallace came out of the water, and he was deathly sick for weeks, because whether he had pneumonia or a bad cold, I don't know, but he barely got out. But the other warden, succumbed. And so, I mean, these were different days. These were different days.
Dick, can you give us some idea of how the cranberry industry was around Sand Hill? When did that start?
The cranberry industry, legislatively, in terms of state statutes, started in the 1870s. And they've locked up water quality issues since that time, really. Up until the time I retired, you couldn't touch them in the DNR, with any of the stuff they were going out there. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily good or bad, but in any event, it was very well situated by the time he got there. Why they didn't already have possession of what became Sand Hill Game Farm, I do not know, because there were commercial bogs all the way around it for the most part, except to the south, which is Necedah National Wildlife Refuge, which incidentally was not formed until 1938. And then many of you probably don't realize it, but the largest collection of wildlife areas in the entire state of Wisconsin, in terms of the fleet of wildlife areas the Wisconsin DNR has under the Bureau of Wildlife Management, are right there in central Wisconsin. Wood County Wildlife Area, get a load of this. Wood County Wildlife Area, 30,000 acres. Immediately across the road, you spit across the road, Meadow Valley Wildlife Area, 60,000 acres. Sand Hill Wildlife Area, 10,000 acres, and if you want, you could throw in the Necedah National Wildlife Refuge, 40,000 acres, and if you want to go next door into Jackson County Forest Lands, and then the state forest, Black River State Forest. Huge collection of public lands in Wisconsin, and the people that, like myself, that worked there, we always loved it, because anybody from Madison, Milwaukee knew nothing about it. They would drive all the way around it and go up to northern Wisconsin and frolic and come all the way back down, when they could have frolicked right there in central Wisconsin, because it's the same stuff. So really neat. Other questions?
Comment.
Yeah.
50 years ago, I stood in that exact spot that photographer stood in and took a picture of the Chippewa crossing of the bridge.
Really?
Yes. I was the ranger in Ladysmith.
Were you really? Yeah. Yeah.
Are you ready? So
Well,
I
you
saw that-
gotta get a copy of this book. It's you're probably in it. But Ladysmith, I mean, his stories about Ladysmith of the mills and all of that stuff. It's just just not.
We worked with Bert Dahlberg.
Oh, sure.
His dad.
His dad was Edwin.
Yeah.
Yep.
Fantastic people.
Yep. Quite frankly, it's amazing, neat history. Sadly, I think, I especially at Sand Hill Wildlife Area, I worked with a lot of younger people who now are actually in their 40s. In fact, yesterday I couldn't believe it. I opened up my email, and here's a lady who's got to be around 40, who popped me an email and said, I used to work with you at Sand Hill Wildlife Area when I was a high school student. And she's now an aquatic ecologist working at the Scripps Institute out in, La Jolla, California. And I was like, how'd she find me? But when I saw the name, I knew exactly who it was. And so, this connectivity is something that we all need to do to keep people remembering that, we're part of a train that started, you know, a long time ago, and it keeps on going. But if we don't talk to these young people, they'll know nothing about what preceded them, and that's the sad thing. That's one reason why I really like history and always have. So really neat. So any other questions?
Nicely done.
What's that?
Nicely done.
Oh, thank you. You guys have a good day, and thank you for inviting me.